Welcome back, everybody. And as we cross over that midpoint into the semester, we return to chapter content that for many of you perhaps looks or feels more familiar and probably resonates more with some of your interests in terms of why you are a pre-major taking this course. So welcome to week 9, where we talk about the field of journalism. This is an interesting chapter. It's a far-ranging chapter, and I have 2 videos I'm preparing to talk about some key elements and, of course, add some of my own ideas to this idea about the journalism profession. So let's move on into part 1 of this 2-part video. We welcome back these old friends, these functions, societal functions that are provided by news. And of course, these functions are perhaps functions that you have read about in other courses. These are drawn particularly from the field of sociology in terms of talking about societal functions. And news is seen to play at least 5 functions in society. Obviously, there's the fourth estate function, the idea that in social democratic societies, the news play a role in providing a watchdog service for the people, in keeping and reporting on keeping their eyes on and reporting what's going on in areas like the government and public practice and private practice and the business community. So that first function is an important one, particularly in democratic cultures, social democratic cultures, where the news can provide a surveillance function on society. A fairly new a new function that we really haven't talked about much in previous chapters when we were discussing other media is the correlation function. And one can also argue that because there's an intrinsic relationship and a very, very delicate relationship between newsmakers and gatekeepers who make the news, who produce and write stories and distribute story content through networks and print vehicles and online vehicles, that the news operations in our culture have to be careful about not alienating news sources. And as a result, people in Congress, the president, local government officials know that they have power in this relationship with journalists. And so as a result, they can also influence the kinds of stories that get covered and the types of issues that are discussed and in certain ways. So they are able in some ways to correlate their belief system and make sure that society hears a particular view of reality. I'm not saying that's a negative thing. That has a stabilizing effect in governments and in societies and cultures and communities. But it's in some ways the flip, if you will, of the surveillance function. News, of course, also provides information on a daily basis about what's going on in culture, from everything from pop culture to serious events in the days. And so as a result, culture is reinforced and news provide a cultural transmission function. We also know that news can be extremely important, for example, in times of emergency. If there's flooding, if there's significant rain and floods are pouring out of the hills to the west of us here in Las Vegas, people will often turn to those news sources that are considered to be more on top of stories and more immediate in terms of their coverage of events in order to mobilize the public, to keep them safe. That's just one way that journalism can mobilize the public. And of course, we now know, and journalism has learned, that it also provides an entertainment function. It often has to, in order to lighten the load of otherwise dreary stories that are covered in, say, a half-hour newscast. So 5 functions, at least, served up by journalism. Well, what is news? There are a number of things mentioned in your chapter. You go on in, some of you are taking 102 from other professors and instructors and learning how to do print reporting, how to write stories. And so I'm sure you've discussed in those classes what constitutes news. There are many different definitions of news. When I took reporting and writing as an undergraduate many years ago, we were taught the who, what, why, when, where, and sometimes how in terms of ways to structure stories, the basic information elements. Your chapter addresses in some ways, slightly different perspectives and takes on this. And so we'll address those. and I'll embellish a little bit here and there. For your authors, news is, first and foremost, essentially out of the ordinary events. And that's true. You talk to any journalist, you talk to any journalism professor, and they'll tell you that one function of news is to cover the extraordinary, the unusual, the rare and odd event. And you can't open up a newspaper, you can't turn on a streaming news feed, you can't go to your favorite news website, and on a daily basis, we all click on those stories and watch those videos of rare and weird things. So one of the functions of news, of course, is to provide us with information about strange and different events. News is also, of course, reporting about hard news, negative events, what your author calls negative events, events that happen in the world that are catastrophic, are important to know about, maybe geologically based, floods, earthquakes, airplane crashes, natural disasters, and human disasters. This is a requisite function of news. Mayhem, murder, these are stories that often lead and dominate local reporting, particularly, for example, television news. And we know this from research that we've done in terms of content analysis. There are also pseudo-events, and it's an important area for you to think about because a lot of what happens in, say, local television or even network television newscasts, and consequently the stuff that some of you are engaging in terms of streaming video content, at your favorite news websites. A lot of that isn't really news, but it's heavily promoted material that's created and packaged by people with a particular interest. So any public or private interest groups often create news and distribute it to news outlets, hoping that they'll put it on air or they'll load it up on their websites. Pharmaceutical companies do this all the time when introducing a new drug. And you'll see, for example, local newscasts where a so-called local health reporter will report on this latest drug. Well, they're just utilizing these materials, sometimes without even editing them or changing the editorial slant as part and including them as part of their newscasts. Very commonly done. Press conferences. Politics, we've seen a lot of that recently. I'm talking to you in the fall of 2013, and we're having some issues in Congress relative to the economy, relative to the debt, relative to Obamacare. And so we're seeing constant positioning, if you will, or efforts to position one political, ideological viewpoint against another through so-called pseudo-events and press conferences, which make up a lot of what we encounter on a daily basis in terms of news. A lot of news, of course, also includes human interest stories. And the news doesn't happen on a regular basis. Hard news comes and goes. Talk to anybody in the journalism business, and I've had former students who were news producers, for example, in local television stations. And sometimes they'll tell me, I can't go to class today, Dr. Trout, because there's just nothing happening in the world. And you know, I've got all my crews out, and we're trying to figure out what to put on for the 5:30 news. And the truth is, there's always stuff going on, but it's what constitutes in their minds newsworthiness that will grab the attention of the viewer. And so often these are human interest stories, and you'll see a lot of this, particularly on days where there isn't a lot of out of the ordinary or negative news occurring. So those are some things I want you to consider as you read this chapter. In the next section of this video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about news and bias in news, and some of the historical trends in news that might surprise you. So thanks for watching, and I'll get back to you real soon when you click on the next video.